Israel says that it is still planning a military offensive in the city of Rafah in southern Gaza, and that's despite the fact that it has already withdrawn many of its troops from the area. Allies, including the United States, have warned Israel against mounting this operation, but Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says that it's necessary for the fight against Hamas.
Airstrikes on Rafah, seen from Israel, which has for months said they would be followed up by a ground invasion. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has not softened his line.
We will complete the elimination of the Hamas brigades, including in Rafah. There is no force in the world that will stop us.
But 6 months into the war, Israel now faces strong pressure from its main ally, the US, to rein in military operations and not to mount a full-scale ground invasion into Rafah, where more than 1 million people live in close conditions.
We have made clear to Israel that we think a full-scale military invasion of Rafah would have an enormously harmful effect on those civilians and that it would ultimately hurt Israel's security.
Israel has 2 ways to root out Hamas: a full-scale ground campaign or a more targeted one. A full-scale invasion would probably look like what has already happened in other parts of Gaza, in urban areas like Khan Yunis and Gaza City further north from Rafah. An air campaign combined with tanks and troops on the ground, at a potentially catastrophic cost to civilians. Israel has said it will evacuate civilians to elsewhere in Gaza, but has given no specifics. This kind of ground invasion would further antagonize the US, which has conditioned future military support on how Israel treats civilians in Gaza. But Israel has also shown it can mount targeted operations. Earlier this month, commandos recovered the body of Elad Cancian, who had been taken hostage on October 7th. These raids rely on precise intelligence rather than overwhelming firepower. Which path Israel chooses may come down to politics. In the US, President Joe Biden faces significant pressure from the left to restrain Israel. While at home, Benjamin Netanyahu faces a public that overwhelmingly wants to defeat Hamas once and for all.
Well, I'm joined now by Colonel Marc Cancian. He served over 3 decades in the U.S. Marine Corps. He's now a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Colonel, it's good to have you with us on this Tuesday. We just start by asking you, can Israel defeat Hamas without entering Rafah?
The answer to that, unfortunately, is probably no. There's been suggestions that they might surround the city and then use targeted attacks on identified strongholds. But that will take a long time. The Israelis can't find them all. Hamas has been very good about digging in and hiding. So if Israel really wants to do what it says it wants to do, that is destroy Hamas, unfortunately, they'll have to go in on the ground.
And does that mean also accepting the fact that there will be thousands and thousands of civilians whose lives will be endangered, perhaps also whose lives will be killed?
And unfortunately, that's what would happen. We've seen that happen in the other big cities, Gaza and Khan Yunis. It would likely happen in Rafah. And it's exacerbated by the fact that Hamas is willing to use civilians as human shields to protect its military forces. The Israelis might try to move civilians out and be careful about its use of firepower, but if it goes in, there's no way to prevent large civilian losses.
We have reported now for quite some time the Israeli Prime Minister announcing that an offensive in Rafah is in the near future, but it still hasn't happened. What does that tell you then, the fact that this ground offensive still hasn't begun?
Well, it says 2 things. First, Israel has been mopping up in central and northern Gaza. It's also been distracted by things like these drone strikes, missile strikes from Iran, and then the Israeli response. So it hasn't really had a chance to focus on Rafah. But it is true that right now, it doesn't look like the Israelis are massing the forces they would need to capture the city. In fact, all that's been happening for the last couple of weeks in Gaza is what you might call skirmishing. Most of the action has been elsewhere.
And the fact that we haven't seen this offensive begin in Rafah, what do you think that means for Hamas? Is it given Hamas time to prepare for it and maybe to re-fortify its positions?
Well, it does, but Hamas has had 20 years to fortify its positions, so another couple of weeks is not going to make a lot of difference. They probably are laying in weapons and munitions, although the Israelis are trying very hard to prevent any military supplies from getting in. Mostly, I think the Hamas is waiting and seeing what the Israelis will do. They've also been infiltrating forces further north, getting them into Khan Yunis, Gaza City. The Israelis are constantly skirmishing with Hamas forces that pop up, so to speak, behind Israeli lines.
And, considering what we have seen in the last 6 months, would you say that the operations by the IDF, are we approaching a point when Israel will be able to say with conviction that it has defeated Hamas, that it's on the road to defeating Hamas?
Well, if the Israelis do take Rafah or do squeeze it, they can claim that they have defeated Hamas. And it's an important distinction between defeated and destroyed. The Israelis have talked before about destroyed, but that's almost impossible. There'll be enough of Hamas left that they can reconstitute. But defeat, that is possible. The tough question, though, is, okay, what happens after the Israelis finish with Rafah? Either they occupy Gaza, which they tried before and was very unsuccessful, and they don't want to do it. And the United States certainly doesn't want the Israelis to do that. The ideal solution would be some sort of Arab peacekeeping force, but Arab countries don't want to take on that responsibility. They also don't want to be seen to be suppressing Hamas. So the day after Rafah is a question up in the air, and we'll be talking about that in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll be talking about that for quite some time to come, that's for sure. Colonel Marc Cancian, as always, Colonel, it's good to have you on the program. Good to get your analysis. Thank you.
Thanks for having me on the show.